Elias measured his days by the slow crawl of the sun across the vast, bleached canvas of the prairie. His life was a ritual of solitude, a penance he had chosen years ago, etched into the lines around his eyes and the callous geography of his hands. The wind was his most constant companion, a ceaseless whisper that spoke of distance and dust and things long buried. It was the wind that first told him something was wrong. It carried a scent that did not belong, the sour tang of fear mixed with the metallic hint of stale blood, a smell that snagged in the back of his throat. He was riding the southern fence line, a place where his land dissolved into an unclaimed ocean of grass, checking the posts his father had sunk into the earth a lifetime ago. He found the wire first, snapped clean and coiled back on itself like a wounded snake. Then he saw the tracks. Not the familiar cleft prints of his cattle, but the deep, gouged marks of shod horses ridden hard, and the messy scuffs of heavy, booted feet. They had churned the earth with a careless violence, a violation of the prairie's profound stillness. He dismounted, his hand resting on the smooth, worn stock of the rifle in its scabbard, a gesture as unconscious as breathing. He followed the trail of disruption, his gaze sweeping the ground, reading the brutal story left behind. And then he saw it. A shape that did not belong to the landscape of grass and stone. Tied to a fence post with thick, crude rope was a burlap sack, the kind used for grain, stained with dark, irregular patches. It was slumped and still, an object of refuse discarded in the empty wilderness. But as he watched, a faint, wretched tremor ran through it. A shuddering, convulsive movement that was undeniably, terribly, alive. The wind fell silent, as if holding its breath. He approached with the slow, deliberate patience he used for a cornered animal, his steps measured and soft on the dry ground. The form inside the sack made a low sound, a guttural rasp that was not quite a whimper and not quite a growl, the sound of a creature that had forgotten how to make human noises. His knife, honed for skinning hides and cutting leather, slid from its sheath with a whisper of steel. He did not cut the sack. He cut the ropes that bound it to the post, severing its connection to this place of violation. The sack slumped forward, and he caught it before it hit the ground. It was impossibly light, a fragile weight against his chest, a bundle of sharp bones and trembling fear. He could feel the frantic, shallow beat of a heart hammering against his own steady rhythm. Without a word, without hesitation, he lifted the form into his arms and turned back toward the distant silhouette of his homestead. The setting sun bled across the horizon, casting his shadow long and solitary behind him, the shadow of one man carrying a terrible secret. He walked through the encroaching dusk, the silence of the prairie pressing in on all sides. Inside his small, clean cabin, the air smelled of wood smoke and old leather. He did not place the breathing sack on his bed, an act that would have felt like a claim. Instead, he laid it gently on a clean horse blanket near the cold hearth, an offering of space, a recognition of its wildness. He retreated, leaving it to the shadows, the mystery of what, or who, was inside a silent, breathing question in the quiet dark of his home. Elias understood that trust was a thing built not with words, but with time and silence. He did not approach the burlap shape by the hearth. He did not try to peer inside or speak to it. To force a reckoning with its terror would be just another kind of violence. Instead, he moved with the quiet purpose of his daily rituals, a language of stability in a world that had clearly been torn apart. He filled a tin bowl with cool, clean water from the well and set it on the floor, just beyond the edge of the blanket. Beside it, he placed a thick slice of the dense, dark bread he baked once a week. He did not stare, waiting for a reaction. He turned his back, a deliberate offering of privacy, and sat in his worn armchair across the room. He picked up a length of cracked leather rein and began to methodically work oil into it with a soft cloth, the repetitive motion a meditation. The only sounds in the cabin were the whisper of the oiled rag against leather and the faint, ragged sound of breathing from the floor. Hours passed. The moon climbed the sky, its pale light silvering the single window pane. The breathing from the sack evened out, deepening into what might have been sleep. Elias did not go to his bed. He remained in his chair, the shotgun leaning against the wall beside him, a silent guardian watching over the wounded thing that had washed up on the shores of his solitude. He drifted into a shallow sleep, his senses still attuned to the slightest sound, the slightest shift in the darkness of the room. He was a keeper of a self-made sanctuary, and he would not let the cruel world that had done this breach its walls. He awoke to the thin, grey light of pre-dawn filtering into the cabin. A sliver of movement had disturbed him, a change in the room's deep stillness. He opened his eyes and saw that the burlap form had shifted. The bowl of water was empty. The bread was gone. His gaze remained soft, unfocused, betraying no sudden interest. He rose slowly, his joints protesting the night spent in the chair, and moved without a sound to the door. The air outside was cold and sharp, smelling of damp earth and the promise of a new day. He went about his chores, feeding his horse, drawing fresh water, his movements economical and ingrained with years of repetition. He was giving it time, letting his absence be a comfort, not a threat. When he returned to the cabin, he carried a bowl of warm, thin broth, its steam carrying the scent of salt and herbs. He set it down in the same spot as before, then retreated to the far window, picking up the bridle he'd been mending. He deliberately kept his back to the hearth, his attention seemingly fixed on his work, granting the creature the profound courtesy of not being watched. A soft, tearing sound broke the quiet. The sound of rough fibers giving way. He waited, his entire being focused on the space behind him. After a long time, he allowed himself to turn. The burlap had been ripped open, a ragged hole torn just large enough for a single eye to peer out. It was a wild, fierce eye, the color of a gathering storm, and it was fixed on him. It held no plea, no softness, only a feral and profound suspicion. It was the eye of a hawk, a creature of the high, lonely places, trapped in a cage of terror and dirt. In that moment, he saw not a victim, but a survivor. The days that followed fell into a slow, delicate rhythm, a silent dance of patience and fear. Each morning, he would leave food and water, and each day, a little more of the woman was revealed. The burlap sack was slowly dismantled, piece by piece, as if she were shedding a skin that did not belong to her. First came a matted tangle of dark hair, caked with mud and burrs. Then a bruised, swollen cheekbone, a split lip healing into a pale scar. Her clothes were little more than rags, torn and stained, clinging to a body that was all sharp angles and trembling exhaustion. He never spoke, never offered help in her task, knowing it was something she had to do for herself. The cabin became a chrysalis where this broken being might, or might not, find the strength to re-emerge. One evening, as she sat huddled in the firelight, the flickering flames illuminated a detail on the collar of her ruined tunic. It was a crude letter, M, stitched into the cloth with thick, black thread. It was not a monogram, it was a mark of ownership, a brand burned into fabric instead of flesh. A cold, familiar rage settled deep in Elias's belly, a ghost from his own violent past rising from its grave. The next morning, he took one of his own clean, worn cotton shirts and laid it carefully on the edge of the blanket. He left the cabin for hours, giving her the solitude she needed. When he returned, the pile of rags was gone. She was wearing his shirt. It swallowed her small frame, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times, but it was clean. It was unmarked. As dusk settled, she spoke for the first time. Her voice was a dry whisper, a rustle of dead leaves. Miller's property. She did not look at him. It was not a plea or a confession. It was a statement of fact, a recitation of a truth she had been forced to learn. Elias did not answer her with words. Language was a clumsy, inadequate tool for what needed to be said. He stood up, walked to the hearth, and picked up the discarded pile of rags. He held up the tunic so she could see the stitched gem one last time in the dim light. He met her gaze, his own eyes dark and unreadable. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, he dropped the garment into the crackling fire. They watched together as the flames licked at the cloth, the black threads of the brand curling into nothingness, the symbol of her bondage turning to smoke and ash. When it was gone, he looked at her again, his expression unwavering, and gave a single, sharp shake of his head. No. The gesture was an oath, a negation of her entire world, a promise. A profound shift occurred in the days that followed. The fearful stillness that had clung to her began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative curiosity. She started to move about the cabin, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. She would watch him for hours as he worked, her stormy eyes tracking the movement of his hands as he repaired a saddle or sharpened a blade. One afternoon, he picked up a small, smooth river stone from the mantelpiece and held it out to her. She flinched but took it, her fingers closing around its cool, solid weight. The next day, he gave her a block of soft pine and his whittling knife. He was not just offering distraction, he was offering agency, purpose. He was giving her back her hands, letting her feel the power to shape something, to create rather than merely endure. She began to carve, her movements clumsy at first, then growing in confidence, shaving away thin curls of wood to reveal the form hidden within. A change came to the sky. The endless, placid blue of the prairie summer curdled into a bruised, ominous purple, the color of an old wound. The wind, once a gentle whisper, began to howl, a mournful, angry sound that rattled the single window pane and moaned under the door. A storm was coming, a physical manifestation of the violence that had been visited upon this land. As the first fat drops of rain began to spatter the dusty ground, Elias saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the darkening ridgeline to the east. They were not neighbors. Their posture was wrong, arrogant, predatory. They sat their horses with a lazy entitlement that spoke of men who took what they wanted without asking. Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. His gaze flicked from the riders to the woman. She stood by the hearth, the carving knife still in her hand, her face a mask of chalky white. The storm in her eyes, which had begun to calm, was now a raging tempest of pure, animal terror. She had seen them too. The world shrank to the confines of the small cabin. Elias moved calmly to the door and slid the heavy wooden bar into place. It was a flimsy defense, but a necessary ritual. He turned and looked at her, truly looked at her. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the piece of pine she had been carving. Her breath came in shallow, silent gasps. The men on the ridge were not a random threat. They were a reckoning. They were her past, riding hard to reclaim its property. And the storm, in all its fury, was about to break directly over their heads. The pounding on the door was a brutal percussion, a fist of raw power against the aging wood. "Miller," a voice boomed, thick with whiskey and crude authority. "I know you're in there, old man. Send out what's mine." The voice belonged to a world of noise and force, a world Elias had long since abandoned. He did not answer. He turned from the door and took his old shotgun down from the hooks above the mantel. The gun was heavy, solid, its worn wooden stock smooth and familiar in his hands. He felt a profound calm settle over him, the cold, clear focus of a man with nothing left to lose but the sanctuary he had built. To his side, the woman was a statue carved from fear, her eyes fixed on the splintering door. Another blow shuddered through the cabin, and a crack appeared in the central plank. "Don't make me burn you out. I paid good money for that thing. It's my property." The word echoed in the small space, a profanity that desecrated the quiet. With a final, splintering crash, the door burst from its hinges and slammed against the interior wall. 3 figures filled the opening, dark shapes against the tumultuous, rain-lashed world outside. The leader, a big, bearded man with cruel, small eyes, took a step inside, a sneer twisting his lips. He was Miller. Before he could take a second step, Elias raised the shotgun and fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, a roar of thunder that momentarily eclipsed the storm. Splinters exploded from the floorboards at Miller's feet. The sneer vanished, replaced by shock. Smoke curled from the barrel of the gun. "She is not property," Elias said. His voice was a low, hard rumble, dredged up from a place of deep conviction. The words hung in the sulphur-scented air, simple and absolute. A line had been drawn. Miller's shock curdled into a dark, ugly amusement. He let out a harsh bark of a laugh. "Look at you, old man, playing protector. She's too wild for the likes of you. Untamable. Only good for one thing, and you ain't got the stomach for it." He gestured to his men, and they fanned out, advancing into the cabin with the predatory confidence of a pack of wolves cornering a sheep. But Elias was no sheep. The fight was a thing of brutal, close-quarter ugliness. It was not the clean, heroic combat of stories, but a desperate, grunting scramble of swinging fists and crashing bodies in the cramped space. Elias was competent, his movements economical and fueled by a cold rage, but he was one man against three. A fist caught him high on the cheekbone, sending a spray of blood from his lip. One of the thugs grabbed the shotgun, twisting it from his grip. As Elias grappled with him, Miller saw his chance, lunging forward, his hands reaching, not for Elias, but for the woman cowering by the hearth. And in that instant, everything changed. A movement flashed from the shadows, impossibly fast. It was her. But she was not the terrified, trembling creature she had been moments before. She moved with the fluid, deadly grace of the kestrel he had seen hunting over his fields. Her face was a mask of incandescent fury, all the terror burned away to reveal a core of pure, unadulterated rage. In her hand, she gripped the piece of pine she had been carving, its end now sharpened to a lethal point. A scream tore from her throat, a sound not of fear, but of reclamation, a sound that had been buried for years under layers of pain and violation. She lunged, not away from the monster, but toward him, and drove the sharpened stake deep into Miller's side. The big man grunted, a sound of profound surprise, and staggered back, his hands fumbling at the piece of wood now embedded in his flesh. The other two men froze, their brutish confidence shattered by this sudden, spectral violence from the creature they had considered less than human. She stood straight, her small frame radiating a power that filled the room. Her chest heaved, not with sobs, but with ragged, empowering breaths. Blood, Miller's blood, was smeared across her cheek like war paint. She raised her head, and her stormy eyes, now burning with a terrible, righteous fire, met those of the two remaining thugs. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed the blooded tip of the wooden stake at their fallen leader, who was groaning on the floor. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer a whisper of resignation. It was a verdict. A curse. A declaration of sovereignty. Miller's property, she hissed, the words transformed into a blade of judgment. She owned him now, by right of survival, by the law of the wild. The two men stared, their faces pale with a new kind of fear. This was not a woman. This was a spirit of vengeance conjured from the prairie dust. Faced with this untamable fury and the cold, steady barrel of the recovered shotgun now back in Elias's hands, their courage evaporated. They grabbed their bleeding leader by the arms and dragged him backward out of the cabin, stumbling away into the howling chaos of the storm, leaving only the splintered door and the profound silence of victory behind. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived. By dawn, the wind was again a gentle sigh, and the sky was scrubbed clean, a pale, hopeful blue. The rain had washed the dust from the air and the blood from the threshold, leaving the world feeling new and fragile. Inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled. It was not the silence of loneliness or fear, but a shared stillness, heavy with unspoken understanding. Elias sat in his chair while she tended to the gash on his cheek, her touch hesitant at first, then growing sure and steady. She cleaned the wound with a cloth dipped in whiskey, her brow furrowed in concentration. He did not flinch. Her hands, which had once trembled with terror, then wielded a weapon with righteous fury, were now instruments of gentle healing. The act was an unspoken language, a mending of more than just skin. Days later, the rhythm of their life found its new form. He was in the corral, working with his most difficult horse, a fiery chestnut mare with eyes as wild as the woman's had been. The horse fought the rope, tossing its head, refusing to be tamed. The woman came out of the cabin and leaned against the fence, watching. Under her steady gaze, a change came over the mare. Its panicked movement slowed, its ears swiveled forward, and a low, curious nicker rumbled in its chest. The woman walked to the gate, unlatched it, and stepped into the corral. She moved without fear, her steps slow and deliberate. She reached the mare and ran a hand down its quivering flank. The horse, which bucked at his own touch, leaned into hers, its whole body seeming to sigh in recognition of a kindred spirit. Elias watched them, a woman and a wild creature, two untamable things finding solace in one another. He turned and walked to the fence where his own saddle was slung, its leather worn and shaped by years of solitary riding. He lifted it down. It was heavy, a tool of control but also of partnership. He walked back to her and held it out. It was not a command. It was not an instruction. It was an offering. A question. Her gaze lifted from the horse and met his. For the first time, the last of the storm had cleared from her eyes, leaving a sky full of quiet, endless possibility. She belonged here, in his saddle, not as property to be ridden, but as a fellow traveler, a partner in the vast, silent wilderness they now called home.